communication, and culture converge through one language, Latin. Its vocabulary and logic shape our everyday lives, and yet we still question whether it's worth studying. Why would we spend time studying a language that's considered dead? The answer is simple. Latin isn't just a language of the past. It's a tool that's capable of shaping how we speak, how we think, and how we learn today. Hi, my name is Therese Ohene-Ologo. All roads lead back to Latin. And today, I want to talk about why Latin, despite what most people think, is actually worth studying. But before we can understand why it matters, we need to understand what Latin actually is. Latin is an Indo-European language that was originally spoken by the Latins, a small group of people living in the Italian peninsula and eastern parts of the Po Valley. Over time, Latin didn't just disappear. What we now call the Romance languages, like Spanish, French, and Italian, are all direct descendants of it. Even after it stopped being spoken in everyday life, Latin remained the backbone of education, communication, and culture. Today, Latin is often seen as a language reserved for academic or traditional purposes. And yes, that's partly true. A huge percentage of scholarly English vocabulary comes from Latin. But that's not the only reason Latin matters, and honestly, it's not even the most important. Because learning a language isn't about words, it's how you think. In fact, Merriam-Webster defines language as a system of words, their pronunciation, and the methods of combining them used and understood by a community. And that part, a community, is essential. Because every time you learn a new language, you're not just memorizing words. You're entering a new system of communication, a new structure of thought shared by a group of people. That process, language acquisition, isn't just about learning Latin or French or German. It's a skill of learning how to learn anything. So every new concept, every new skill, and every new way of seeing the world draws on the same mental habits. Different languages don't just describe the world differently, they actually shape how we interpret it. Some concepts don't even fully translate into English. In Spanish, sobremesa doesn't just mean over the table. It's the lingering conversation after a meal. In Inuit, Insertpok captures the anxious anticipation of waiting for someone to arrive. And in German, Kirmspeck literally means grief bacon, or the gain weight from emotional eating. These aren't just words, they're ways of thinking. Every time you learn a new language, or even just a single new word, you're training your brain to perceive, organize, and interpret the world in a new way. This doesn't just stop at language. Every time you learn a new skill, a profession, a discipline, or even a way of interacting with people, you're stepping into a new system. Each one has its own patterns, its own logic, and its own rules. Language acquisition gives you the skill to navigate them all. It's not just memorization, it's how to think, how to adapt, and how to build new lines of thought. In short, it's the skill of learning anything. So if language acquisition is the skill of learning how to learn anything, why Latin? Why not German or French or Spanish? A lot of people don't want to study Latin because it's dead. And I get it. Why spend time studying something that isn't spoken anymore? But then I have to ask, why do we study history? Most of what we study in history isn't happening anymore either. And if I had to guess, you'd probably say something like, we study the past to understand its legacy so we can recognize it or not repeat it. But in that one sentence, you've already proven why Latin is worth studying. Because words like study, past, recognize, legacy, and repeated all originate from Latin. So even when we think Latin's gone, it's literally still shaping how we communicate. Which means, if you want to understand how language works, then Latin isn't just relevant, it's the most impossible tool for it. Because when you're trying to understand something deeply, you don't want a moving target. You want something stable that you can take apart, analyze, and comprehend. That's why medical students study cadavers. A cadaver isn't alive, it doesn't move, and it doesn't change. But that's exactly what makes it valuable. It gives you a fixed structure to understand how everything works and connects. Latin works the same way. It hasn't changed in over 1,500 years. Its grammar, its structures, and its vocabulary, they're all stable. Which means, when you study Latin, you're not just chasing a language that keeps evolving. You're training your brain on a system you can actually master. And that's why Latin's so powerful. Not because it's spoken, but because it's structured. And once you start training your brain to think in that kind of structure, you start to see the same structure show up in a language you already speak, English. Because if we're being honest, learning English grammar feels kind of pointless. Because assuming English is your first language, when you're speaking it in everyday life, you're not thinking about the subject, tense, or agreement, since these are concepts you've been using since birth. Your brain already knows how to do it, so by the time someone asks you to analyze grammar, name it, explain it, and break it down, it feels difficult. Not because you don't understand it, but because you understand it too intuitively. That's why grammar in school can feel frustrating. You're being asked to consciously examine something you've been doing unconsciously your entire life. And that's where Latin changes everything. Because Latin isn't just one system, it's actually two systems combined. On one side, you have the Germanic vocabulary, simple everyday words like house, woman, man, kind, and swine. These are words we grew up with. They describe concrete everyday reality. On the other hand, you have Latin vocabulary, longer, more complex words that express abstract ideas, femininity, masculinity, virtue, republic, and liberty. And here's the problem. These two halves follow completely different systems. They have different tools, different pronunciations, and different rules. But in school, we're mostly taught the Germanic side, through phonics. So when we run into Latin words, especially in academic writing, we're missing half the system. And think about words like democracy, democratic, and democrat. Why does the stress change in each one? Why does the pronunciation shift? Phonics doesn't really prepare you for that. There's a pattern, but you don't see it unless you understand where these words come from. So what's the system for learning that half of English? Studying Latin. Because once you understand Latin roots, you're not just memorizing words, you're unlocking entire families of meaning. For example, if you know the Germanic word father, you know words like fatherly and fatherhood. But if you know the Latin root pater, suddenly you have patriarch, patriarchal, patriarchy, paternal, patrimony, expatriate, compatriate, patronize, and patronizing. The same thing happens with the word death. From the Germanic side, you get dead, deadly, deadened, and deathly. But from the Latin root mors, you get mortal, immortal, moribund, morbid, mortician, mortuary, postmortem, rigor mortis, mortify, and mortgage. So Latin doesn't just expand your vocabulary, it gives you access to the structures behind English. It takes something you've always used intuitively and makes it visible, logical, and learnable. And it turns out, Latin doesn't just make you better at language, it actually makes you think better. Because once you start to understand how structured language actually is, you realize that it's not about understanding English better, it's about training your brain. So Latin forces you to slow down, pay attention to detail, look for patterns, and hold on to multiple ideas at once. Learning any language is like solving a puzzle, but Latin's more like Sudoku. It's structured, it's logical, and everything connects. And in Latin, that connection is everywhere. It's not uncommon to have one word be untranslatable without reference to every other word in the sentence. And if you've ever had the misfortune of translating Cicero, you know exactly what I'm talking about. By the time you're translating actual literature, you're going to be taking the literal translation, what does the text say, and running it through the grammatical big picture and the cultural backdrop to arrive at the real translation of what does the text mean. That process trains you to conceptualize one thing in the context of many other things and see the connection between them all. A mental habit that's going to have far-reaching applications as you study politics, economics, engineering, music, astronomy, crying kids, or literally anything else in life. Latin is going to grow your brain in big picture and small picture thinking, giving you the dexterity to move back and forth between both. Roman words follow rank and file like Roman soldiers, and what people don't realize, whether it's the Latin naysayers or me when I have to translate the Calendarian orations, is that Latin, or any other subject, is not just about information, but formation. So when people say Latin is a dead language, I don't really see it that way. Because a language that still shapes how we speak, how we write, and how we think isn't dead. We've seen how Latin lives in our vocabulary, and we've seen how it gives structure to English. And more importantly, we've seen how it trains our brains to think, teaching us to see patterns, connections, and meaning. But for me, that wasn't the reason I started. I chose Latin because I didn't have to speak it. Because standing in front of people and talking like this, yeah, no thanks. Of course, I told myself it would help with tests, vocabulary, and practical stuff. But somewhere along the way, that changed. I stopped seeing Latin as just a class or a strategy, and something that I genuinely loved. Because it challenged me immensely, academically and personally. It slowed me down and forced me to think in ways nothing else really had. And now, it's something I want to keep studying, beyond this, into higher education and whatever comes next. Because Latin isn't just about the past, and once you learn to think that way, it changes everything. Thank you.